Good morning, everybody. Today, we have a lecture, and give me just a moment. Good morning, Bella. How are you? All right. Today we have oh, I am good, thank you. Excuse me, I got a little frog in my throat. Okay, back to it. Today we are doing chapter 11, which is evolution. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Add anybody who shows up. Okay. Good. Natural selection, evolution. Now, I do realize that this chapter can be controversial for many folks. It is something that is a challenge to their belief system. I don't know necessarily why that has to be the case, but traditionally it has. So I do want to preface this by saying, anybody who's watching, I don't expect you to believe in all these things. I just want you to understand how it's thought to occur, and that if there is a discussion about it, we can be civil and thoughtful about it and not get too emotionally involved in any of these things. Anyway, with that said, here we go. All right, a couple of jokes. Let's start with the left-hand one. This was sent to me by a student. So why did fish way back when evolve the ability to leave the water? Well, it was because there was a nagging wife. Don't walk away when I'm talking to you. That's why they really got out there. I don't know. I thought it was funny. And then the evolution of dinosaurs into birds, and then the evolution of small furry critters into larger animals. And you can see the change: completely scared, resentful, but running away, facing them, and then eventually into a chicken. I don't know. I thought these were funny. Sent to me by students. There you go. All right. Okay, what is the basic idea of natural selection? Now, what do we mean when we say natural selection? Well, it means that organisms are being selected to be successful. And the selection is by the environment, nature. Nature does the selection. So that's what natural selection means. Some organisms are more successful, some are less. So the basic idea is that organisms can change over generations. Now, most reasonable people would understand that things are not exactly the same as they used to be. Organisms are not identical to the way they used to be thousands or millions of years ago. And so the process by which things change is believed to be by scientists to be natural selection. Another big idea is that individuals with certain heritable, that means inheritable, built into their DNA, leave more offspring than others. Now, what determines whether an organism is going to have more or fewer babies if they're of the same species? Well, fundamentally, the idea is if you happen to have a particular set of genetic characteristics, along with a little luck, you're going to be able to find more food, better mates, better place to live, and that will give you more resources to have more offspring. And that will mean that your genes get passed on more into the next generation. And then your offspring will also have the same genes. They will have more offspring, and your line will be more successful over time than a group of individuals that happen to have a less advantageous gene or circumstance. Okay, so what do each of these mantids show? Okay, well, each one is a little bit more difficult to see. Let's start with this one up here. It is built very much like a dead leaf, difficult to see by both birds that would eat it, as well as its prey, which would be small insects. So when insects look at it, they think, oh, it's just a leaf. They land near it, boom, they're dead. Same thing with this live leaf mantid, as in praying mantis. But the one that's the big success in my opinion is this flower mantid in Malaysia. It looks so much like an orchid that birds would fly right by it and not even see it. As a matter of fact, when it sits there on the leaf, it does this, and it moves just like a leaf swinging in the wind. Pretty cool. But the most important significant thing about this is that it sits right by a flower. Now, what comes to visit flowers? Well, insects that would do pollination. And when they land there, it grabs it and eats it. And if it didn't look just like an orchid, they wouldn't get their meal. So what does that mean? It means over time, the ones that did happen to look very much like the orchids that they pose on got more food. And since they got more food, they could lay more eggs, and those eggs would have that same gene for looking just like a pink orchid. Now, if the orchids went extinct, then these organisms would be in big trouble because they can't change their own coloration. Most organisms can't. Now, some can. For example, chameleons can, octopus can. But most organisms are stuck with whatever hand they're dealt. And if they happen to have an environment near them that matches the DNA that they got, well, then they're successful. If their environment does not match the DNA that they got, or there's bad luck, they're unsuccessful. And they have fewer offspring or they die. Okay, now let's talk about a guy named Lamarck. Lamarck was back in the day, but he was famous for being wrong. And so it's interesting to see, what did he think? And there was really kind of ironically an evolution in the idea of evolution. The idea of how organisms change over time actually evolved as scientists learned more and dug up more fossils and did a little bit more study. Now, back in the mid-1700s, they started digging up fossils. Now, back in the day, even further back in the day, 1600s, 1500s, whenever they would find a big bone like that, they would think, oh, it was a monster bone. Well, in the 1700s, they thought, well, instead of it being a monster bone, maybe it was something from the distant past that had died and decomposed, a very reasonable thing to think. So they started studying fossils in an organized scientific way. So naturalist George Buffon, who was a predecessor of Lamarck, he suggested that the Earth might be older than 6,000 years. Now, what's the significance of that? Well, the church, the Catholic Church especially, had suggested that the Earth was about 6,000 years old for many, many, many hundreds of years. Now, what is that based on? Is it based on science? No. Ironically, it's not even in the Bible how old the Earth is. Where they came up with that 6,000 years had to do with the series of begats. Now, if you've never been to a Catholic Mass, I think it was Christmas Catholic Mass, I have. And what they do is they go through the whole begats, all the way from Adam and Eve up until the Old Testament. And by looking at all the begats that are listed in the Old Testament, they figured out, well, if the generation is about 20 years, and that's about when people would reproduce, if you put all those begats together, that takes you back all the way back to Adam and Eve, and that equals about 6,000 years. And so this is based on a book. And so Buffon said, well, look, things don't happen that quickly. It takes a lot longer for a fossil to form based on what we know. And he said, well, maybe the Earth is not 6,000 years old. Maybe it's more than that. So that laid the groundwork for all of the work that came later with Lamarck and Darwin, who we now know is one of the most famous biologists and most controversial biologists. Now, scientists now understand, beyond all reasonable doubt, that the Earth is not 6,000 years old. It's millions of years old, based on all of the science that we have available to us. There's no scientific evidence that suggests it's 6,000 years old, unless the only scientific evidence that you're looking for is scientific evidence that supports the idea that it's 6,000 years old. Objectively, it's not 6,000 years old. All right, what Buffon did, is he observed similarities between fossils and living species. What he noticed was there were some similarities, but that these fossils were different than what was alive on the planet today. So he wondered, why is it that these fossils are similar, but slightly different? He also noticed that the further down you dig, the more dissimilar or different the organisms are from today. And he started thinking and writing about this. So his writings were taken up by a scientist called Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, French gentleman. Now, he developed this idea, really this idea of change over time, but it was wrong. I mean, he didn't know it was wrong. And I don't know if he was ever told it was wrong, but it was logical given what they knew at the time. So what his idea was that organisms could change themselves based on this inner need to adapt to their environment. And when they changed their own bodies, they could pass that change on to their offspring. Now, we know that that's not correct. For example, let's go with a more current example. I used to talk about Arnold Schwarzenegger, but he's an old man now. Now I talk about, let's say, The Rock. Now, The Rock was not born, Dwayne Johnson, for those of you who don't know. Dwayne Johnson was not born with those muscles. He has those muscles because he works out. Now the question is, he's got kids. Were his kids born with those muscles? No, because it's not genetic. It's something you do to your body. So if his kids, I think he's got 2 little girls. I don't know if he has a little boy. He has 2 little girls, please. They weren't born with big muscles because that's something you have to do to your body. And when you do that to your body, it doesn't change your DNA. So he thought, well, if it's a giraffe and they have to stretch their neck to get some leaves, wouldn't that make their neck a little bit longer if you stretch your neck? Now, it's true that humans can stretch their necks out by putting rings in. Some African cultures do that. But the children of those women who stretch their necks out are not born with longer necks. They're born with regular necks, and each generation has to stretch their neck. But he didn't know that. So he thought that the giraffes who stretch to reach for the leaves, we could pass on that slightly longer stretched out neck to their offspring. So he thought that when you acquire a characteristic, you could pass it on to your offspring. And the classic test of this that was done many years ago was a scientist, it sounds kind of cruel now, he would chop off the tails of rats and note that the babies were still born with tails. So it meant that anything that happened during the lifetime of this rat couldn't be passed on to the offspring. Now, there is a topic called epigenetics, which suggests that certain things, especially high stressors, can affect your DNA, causing it to be expressed differently. But that's a much more nuanced, subtle thing, and something I can talk about later. But generally, we don't get to change our own DNA. And the only thing we give our kids really is DNA. Okay, so this was Lamarck's notion, is that if you have a short-necked giraffe, it stretches its neck to reach more leaves, which are the resources it needs to get what it needs to have offspring. Especially females need to have plenty of energy to gestate and lactate and feed a baby. But that when they stretch their neck out, they could pass on that stretched out neck. Now, the question is this what we see in the fossil record? And the answer is yes. So doesn't that mean he was right? No. So even though the fossil record shows this, what we have come to understand how it works is that if there's a group of giraffes, some of them are going to have slightly longer necks and some will have slightly shorter necks. Not every person, we're all human, is the same height. So what it means is if you are reaching for tall branches, if you're slightly taller, you'll get more food than if you're shorter. So the taller ones are going to have more resources, will have more offspring. Maybe it's only by a little bit. Maybe the taller one will have 3 babies in its lifetime and the shorter one will have 2. Not that big a deal. But if you do it generation after generation, the longer necked ones will have more babies and they'll start taking over. And then in this generation, there's going to be some slightly taller and some slightly shorter. The taller ones get more food, and it keeps exaggerating to what we have now. So these really, really long necks are a result of the fact that the trees were evolving taller and taller to get away from the giraffes, and the giraffes were evolving to get to the food. Now, please note, this is really important. You guys get this. The individual giraffes, the individual butterflies, any of these organisms, they don't change at all during their lifespan, but the group changes. And that is whichever individual in that group happens to have the better trait, for example, a slightly longer neck, passes that long neck on to their offspring. So the individual doesn't ever change, but the group changes because some have more babies and some have fewer. And so it's the group dynamic. The number of individuals changes over time. Okay, so let's talk about Darwin. This is what Darwin looked like as a relatively young man. He got on this boat called the HMS Beagle, and he went with a bunch of sailors and other scientists to explore the world. He wanted to see what could be seen. So he took off here, went to South America. And you can see he went kind of all over the place. But one of the key things is, as he went along here, he collected specimens. Now, most of the specimens he couldn't collect were alive, so he collected their skins and put them in a box. Then he got to this spot. If you guys can see this yellow circle here, it's called the Galapagos Island. This is what really made him understand the differences between groups and what could be causing this to happen. What he noticed was that all of these specimens that he picked up along South America looked different than the ones in the Galapagos. And we'll be talking about more about that later. And eventually he made his way back, went to Australia, Tasmania, Cape of Good Hope, and then again back to South America, I think just to maybe get some more supplies, and back to Great Britain, where he wrote about his exploits and developed his notion of natural selection and evolution. Okay. On his journey on the Beagle, what did Darwin do? He collected thousands of specimens, most of which were skins. But the most important thing that he did is he noticed adaptations in organisms. He noticed that birds living in certain places had certain features like beaks or color or song. And of all the organisms that he noticed that they were pretty well suited for their environment. And he started thinking maybe it was the environment that guided the development of these organisms and not some random arbitrary creation. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Galapagos Islands. Now, as I showed you, this is several hundreds or thousands of miles off the coast of South America. And what we're looking at here is a marine iguana. Now, before we do the notes, if you guys have ever seen an iguana before, you notice they're usually bright green. They have spikes along their back, but most importantly, they have a tail that is designed to balance on trees. If you look at the tail of this iguana, a marine iguana, it is not shaped in a tubular fashion. It's shaped like a paddle. Now, the reason why they have this paddle-shaped tail is so they can swim underwater to eat algae, seaweed. That's their food. In addition, they have nostrils that can close. The green iguanas of the coast, the coastal areas do not have this. So these are adaptations that these iguanas developed over time because their main food source was underwater and not in the trees. There weren't very many trees here. So let's go to these notes. He was intrigued by the distribution of organisms on the Galapagos. So he noticed not only were all of the organisms on the Galapagos Islands different than the mainland, but each island had its own specific ecosystem or kind of environment. And that environment seemed to match the organisms that were on it. So he started thinking maybe it was the environment that guides the development of these groups. The fact that the Galapagos organisms resembled those in South America, but had some significant differences. What were the main differences? Well, they seemed to match the difference in the environment. South America is one large landmass, lots of trees. These were islands that had very few trees on it. So he thought, well, wait a minute. The organisms that I saw in South America are not the same as the ones here. The ones here have very different adaptations because the islands are very different. And he started putting his hypotheses together. Okay, before we get back to Darwin, let's talk a little bit more about Buffon. Remember we talked about Buffon and he was saying maybe the Earth isn't 6,000 years old. So Darwin read Buffon and he read Lamarck. And based on his readings of Buffon, he reasoned that the Earth is very old, way more than 6,000 years old, and has been shaped by slow process. Now, what does this mean? That instead of things just being poof there, that things have changed over time, and it takes a long time to make these changes based on his studies and his reading of other scientists. Subtle processes. Now, what do we mean by subtle? Subtle means something you can't notice obviously. Subtle processes occurring over long periods of time can cause great change. Let me give you an example. I never saw my child grow up. My child has grown up and he is now 19 years old, but I never saw him grow up. The only way that I know he's different now than he was is because I look at pictures and I have memories of the difference. But when I see him every morning, he looks exactly the same as he did the day before. Maybe with a slightly different hair color or a slightly different tan or whatever. But the point is that my son, has changed over the 19 years of his life in ways so subtle that you wouldn't notice it from day to day or even week to week. But with enough time passing and you mark the past and the future or the present, you can see the change, but it takes a long time. And that's just 20 years. The changes that happen to organisms take thousands or millions, usually millions of years to see significant differences. And that means the Earth must be older than 6,000 years because there's just not enough time to have these changes happen if the Earth is only 6,000 years old. All right. This is still considered one of the most controversial books ever written in biology. It's called On the Origin of Species by Darwin. He had no idea it was going to cause such a ruckus, but he wrote it and it took the world by storm because scientists started reading it and they started saying, wow, this actually makes sense. It's just the church wasn't real thrilled with it because it contradicted, by implication, the story of Adam and Eve and the creation story. All right. Organisms inhabiting Earth today descended from ancestral species. The idea is that the organisms today had ancestors that looked different than the ones that look today. Natural selection was the mechanism for descent with modification. This is a key statement, and let me explain it. Natural selection. Nature selects the organisms that are going to survive and reproduce more. Is the mechanism for descent with modification. Now, what does that mean? Your descendants are your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So descent means going down through the generations with modification. Now, what does modification mean? Modification does not mean start from scratch. It means takes what you have and modify it slightly. Imagine that you have your home and you want to modify it, so you make a small change. If you made enough small changes to your home over a 30-year period, your house would look completely different than it did when you started, even though it was a modification. So the idea is if you make a tiny, tiny change to the group, not the individual, and you replicate that change over and over and over and over again over many, many, many generations, you can have a big change, but it takes a long time. So natural selection is what caused the modifications over time through the descendants. Okay, fossils. Well, what is a fossil? Fossils are not always bones. They are the preserved remnants or impressions left by organisms that lived in the past. For example, dinosaur footprints are still fossils because it's some evidence of what was happening or what was living at that time when the fossil was formed. They're often found in sedimentary rocks. Now, why are they found in sedimentary rocks? Well, you can't find them in igneous rocks, which are lava-based, because if an organism falls in there, it burns up. Metamorphic rocks, maybe, but the reason why they're found in sedimentary rocks is the following. For example, let's look at this fossil fish. Fish died, landed on the bottom, nothing came by and saw it as a meal, so it got covered with silt. You guys know that if you leave things long enough, stuff gets covered with dust. Well, underwater, things get covered with silt, which is kind of the underwater equivalent of dust. Now imagine if you let dust go week after week, year after year, you'd have a really thick layer of dust, especially in the high desert where we have heavy winds. Dirt comes through, and eventually, if you give something a couple of years of sitting out on the surface of the desert, it's going to be covered pretty soon with sand, with silt, with dust, whatever. And eventually it's underground. So when it becomes underground, it decomposes, and what was there, the bones and the other tissues, get preserved. Sedimentary rocks means that you cover it with a slight layer of silt and it gets preserved. Okay, now I may be asking you to tell me about this figure, this process, so take notes. So let's start off here. Rivers bring sediment or dirt to the ocean or a lake. Either one could be the case. Now, when the river is flowing, it can be muddy because mud is held in moving water. So for example, if you have water, you shake it up, it's going to be muddy. If you leave that water that's muddy sitting, the mud settles out, the sediments settle out, and you have clear water on the top and dirt on the bottom. Same thing happens when the river containing mud arrives at the ocean or at a lake. Lake is even better because the water's not moving at all. The sediments settle to the bottom. Notice here it's showing several layers of different times that the river brought different sediments. Okay, next. Over time, additional layers are added containing fossils from each time period. So let's go back to the original picture. Let's imagine that there's an organism living in the water and it dies. It sinks to the bottom and the mud from the river covers it. It doesn't get eaten. It just dies, falls to the bottom, gets covered. Now, over time, more and more layers cover this dead organism and it becomes a fossil. Now, because the environment changes a lot, sometimes places that were oceans or lakes are now dry areas. Now, how do we find these things? Erosion. Now, if a river cuts through this old lake bed, what you get to see are all of the organisms that died at each time period. What you note is that the organisms in the upper layers are more similar to today's organisms, and the organisms in the bottom layers are much different from today's organisms. Why is that the case? Well, because the world is different now than it used to be. The habitats, the environment, the climate, the weather, mountains, lakes, rivers, all different than they used to be. So you get to see evidence of the past just by looking at these old layers. Is it possible these layers could flip over? It does happen, yes. But 99% of the time, the oldest stuff is on the bottom, the newest stuff is on the top. And if you wanted to look at a dump, a human, what they call landfill, you would see the newest trash on the top and the oldest trash on the bottom. Makes perfect sense. So the idea here is that you can look and see what changes have happened over time by looking at the fossils. And if you know how old the layers are, you know what was happening at that time based on the fossils that were trapped in that layer. And there's the Grand Canyon, perfect example of that. You can see the different layers that were laid down over time. So if you dig into the walls of the Grand Canyon and you find a fossil, the oldest ones are going to be at the bottom, the newest ones are at the top. So the fossil record is the chronology, which means the study of time, of fossil appearances in rock layers. So it basically gives evidence of what was happening at that time that that layer was formed. Chronology means you can tell how old stuff is. What it does is it testifies that organisms have appeared in a historical sequence. That is, it's evidence of things changing over time because each layer contains different types of organisms. And not all of it happened at one time. Some people suggest that all of these fossils were formed during the Great Flood, but you really have to tie yourself in a logical knot. And there's no evidence, really solid scientific evidence that suggests that, unless you're looking just for the evidence that would support that story. The key is, even though it's one part, it fits with all the other evidence of evolution. For example, genetic evidence and evidence we find in the bones of different organisms that are related to each other. All of these things work together. In a trial, you're not usually going to get convicted with just one piece of evidence. You need eyewitness, you need genetic evidence, you need circumstantial evidence. All these things work together to convict an accused criminal. And so if we're talking about something that's so important, like how did things change over time, you need lots of bits of evidence, and all the evidence that scientists have gathered, scientists that aren't biased, suggest that this is the mechanism through which things have changed over time. Okay, paleontologists. These are both paleontologists. This is one speaking about Allosaurus. I know it's Allosaurus because it has the spike on its head. This is a paleontologist digging up a dinosaur bone. Now, before we finish this notes, let's talk about this really quickly. Why do you usually see paleontologists wrapping bones with plaster? Well, the reason why is most bones are crushed. Now, the question is, why are most bones that you would find underground crushed? Well, think about how most mammal and dinosaur bones are built. If you ever look at a mammal bone, especially our own, they're hollow on the inside. We keep marrow inside of there. In the spongy ends, we keep red marrow. In the center, the hollow, fully hollow section, we keep fat. So imagine if you died, and you were put under the ground and more layers got built up, the weight of that soil is heavy. Your bones are hollow and they're not infinitely strong. And in addition, the calcium of your bones get replaced with other chemicals. Now, when that happens, the weight of the soil on top crushes the bones, cracking them. So what paleontologists do is they take that bone that's crunched into bits, wrap it up with plaster, take it back to the museum or the institution and put them back to basically glue them back together like a jigsaw puzzle. And that's why you often see dinosaur bones that look like a jigsaw puzzle, because they were crushed by the weight of the soil above them. All right, so what are they? They're scientists that study fossils. They've discovered many transitional forms that link past and present. Now, for a long time, there were people that were unconvinced with this notion that mammals had evolved from fish, or vertebrates, land vertebrates had evolved from fish. Well, this organism that you see here, Tiktaalik, is the missing link that many people claimed didn't exist. And when they found it, they realized that it has equal parts fish and equal parts like amphibian. And when you look at it, it has many, many fish features and many, many amphibian features. So it's a perfect connection between fish and amphibians. And this organism was able to crawl on land to a certain extent, but had to go back into the water for certain activities. So even modern amphibians have to go back into the water to lay their eggs, which shows a link to the past of being fish-like. Anyway, Tiktaalik, if you're interested in Tiktaalik, there may be an extra credit question asking you to tell me as much as you can about this organism. So you might want to look this up, write this word down, Tiktaalik. And the discovery of Tiktaalik, the scientists who discovered it, there's about a 5-minute YouTube video and a longer one if you want to watch it. And there may be a question about this organism, how it was discovered and what its significance is on the next test as extra credit. So do some research, watch a video, look it up on the webpage. I know most of you guys don't like reading, and I get it, but watch the YouTube video that is about 5 minutes long on this organism. It's pretty cool. How they discovered it, what its significance is, what does it mean for natural selection and evolutionary research. Okay, so let's talk about the evolution of whales. Now, scientists discovered, and by the way, this is going to be an actual essay on the test, so you do need to be able to understand this. Take detailed notes because I'm going to be asking you, what do these pictures show? So what I would do if I were you is I would watch this lecture and go slowly through it. Go slowly through it and take some detailed notes. All right, let's get through this. Now, this organism was called Basilosaurus because when they first discovered it, they thought it was a dinosaur. They didn't realize it was a mammal whale ancestor. So that's why it has the saurus ending. They didn't realize it had flukes. But one of the things that's really different about this, there's a couple of things that are really different about this whale ancestor that is not the case for modern whales. Is modern whales have their nostril way up above their eye. Basilosaurus had it in front of their eye, still showed that they were coming up to the surface and breathing like modern whales do. But the most significant difference is the pelvic fins. Modern whales don't have pelvic fins or pelvic bones. This is the pelvic bones of the Basilosaurus. Now, what did they use these pelvic fins for? Well, it helped them turn quickly in shallow water to hunt their prey. But most importantly, it helped them hang on to each other while they were mating. And so they needed these because their environment was not the same as modern whales. Now, over time, over many millennia, these pelvic fins were no longer needed. And so all it did to modern whales was slow them down. Imagine you have to swim 100, 200 miles a day. Having these things sticking out, slowing you down, is not going to make you any better at having the resources you need to mate. If you're a male whale and you've used up too much energy dragging these pelvic fins around, well, maybe you don't have enough energy to demonstrate that you're the toughest male to mate. If you're a female and you're dragging these around, you don't have as much food to feed your offspring, so you don't have as many. So over the lifespan of a whale, she would have 8 offspring instead of 10. Is that a big deal? Not in that generation, but if that happens over and over and over again, pretty soon it would be better not to have pelvic fins if you're swimming long distances. Now, I said Basilosaurus needed to be able to turn quickly to find its food in the shallow water. Modern whales don't do that. They go for krill or other forms of plankton. And these plankton balls are huge, but they're far apart. So they go and eat a bunch of this plankton, but then they have to swim a long distance to the next one. Basilosaurus would stay in one area and find food by turning quickly. So having these pelvic fins did not help them in any way. So over time, they lost them. Now, is there any evidence that there's a connection between these two? What if they were completely separate organisms? Well, the connection is here. So if you look at the skeleton, by the way, this is a right whale, but almost all whales have this. If you look in that area where the pelvis used to be in the Basilosaurus, you still see these what are called vestigial pelvic bones. Vestigial means something left over from the past that doesn't have much use. Now, why do whales have this? Well, it turns out these are embedded in the fat and muscle tissue of the whale. It doesn't slow them down. So there's no evolutionary or natural selection pressure to get rid of these bones. There was pressure to get rid of the fin because it was slowing down modern whales, making them less fit. So you see in whales, these pelvic bones, which are the vestige, the leftover, the random changes that happen to these bones after the fin was removed. They still have them because there's no real cost for making it. It doesn't slow them down, so why get rid of it? We have an appendix that has no real function. Why don't we get rid of it? Because there's no real problem with it unless it becomes infected. Most of our ancestors didn't have a problem with their appendix, so no good reason to get rid of it. As a matter of fact, your appendix has this very small function in your immune system, as well as harboring bacteria that help you digest. So if you thought your appendix was useless, it's not. But interestingly, the word appendix comes from the term appendix of a book, which means added on at the end. So early scientists thought our appendix was just kind of there, had no function. Anyway, tonsils, the same thing. But I will tell you one vestigial thing we have, which has no function at all, and that is goosebumps. You ever seen how your hairs will stand up when you're cold? That's a vestigial physiological reaction to cold or being creeped out. Now, where does that come from? The hair standing up on end is a vestige of our distant ancestors who would get their hair standing up, and when it stood up, if you had more hair on your arm, it would make you warmer because hair standing up give you more insulation than the hairs laying flat. We still do it because there's no reason not to, but it doesn't help us at all. But there's no reason to get rid of it. That's a perfect example of a vestigial thing. In this case, it's a behavior. In the case of the whales, the vestigial thing is their pelvic bones. Now, if you think, well, maybe it's just the right whales, look at these other whales. This is a bowhead whale, and this is a minke whale. They still have those vestigial bones, showing a connection between the present whales and the distant whales. Okay, so you want to learn a little bit more about Basilosaurus? Look it up, but we're not talking about the Basilosaurus that you would find in a video game. Don't look at that one, because when I looked it up, there's a lot of Basilosaurus in a video game, but you're looking for Basilosaurus behavior. And I want to say there's a video that came out years ago, Walking with Ancient Beasts or something like that. Anyway, it shows Basilosaurus and basically living that lifestyle. Anyway, I'm going to move on. Okay, comparative anatomy. What is comparative anatomy? It's the comparison of body structures between different species. I took a class once called comparative anatomy. That is looking at similarities and differences between different species. What it does is it confirms that evolution is a remodeling process. That is, you don't create, natural selection evolution doesn't create brand new organisms. It takes the organisms that were there and modifies them over generations to suit the environment. So for example, even bats that seem so different than mice and rats still have almost all the same characteristics. It's just their finger bones have elongated with skin between them. Not a big change. Seems like a big change, not a big one, allowing them to fly. What does that mean? Okay, so what does remodeling process mean? It means it takes what you take what you have and you make a very tiny change. And if that works, it gets retained. And if it doesn't work, the organism dies out. But if the change is beneficial, then that change is going to be not only retained, but exaggerated over the generations, for example, with bats. Now, what is homology? It's the similarity in structures due to common ancestry. We saw a term called homologous chromosomes in a previous chapter. In this case, homology means that similarities between different species, for example, the hand of a cat, the paw of a cat and the hand of a human, the reason why they're so similar isn't random. It's because we both evolved from a similar creature that had those same bones. So let's take a look at those bones. Here's human bones, here's cat bones, here's whale bones and bat bones. Now, if you look at a whale flipper, you would think, God, this has got nothing to do with my arm. It sure the heck does. Look, these bones with different colors are the same bones, just highly modified. So for whales, what they've done is they've made the upper arm bone really short, the lower arm bones really, really short. The wrist bones are similar, but they added extra phalangeal bones, which are the finger bones. And that's how they ended up with a flipper. If you look at a cat, they have almost the same bones as us, a little bit longer radius, and their fingers, instead of sticking out like ours, have been bent backwards so they can stand on their fingertips. Even a bat has the same bones as we do, same bones as a cat. Why is this the case? Because all of these mammals descended from an ancestral mammal that had these bones. So all you had to do over time was take the bones, and modify them slightly to suit the environment that you live in. Humans use our arms for carrying and throwing. Cats walk on them, whales swim with them, bats fly with them, but same bones inside. It's called homologous structures. All right, comparative anatomy. What's another thing that could tell us, comparative embryology, my bad, comparative embryology. What is embryology? It's the study of how individuals develop from the time they're a fertilized egg into an offspring. Comparative embryology is the comparison of structures that appear during the development of different organisms. So when you look at how does an organism go from a fertilized ovum to a newborn baby, that's what embryology is, the study of. And if it's comparative embryology, you look at, well, how do certain organisms develop? Let's say, how does a cat develop over its gestational time versus a person, or a shrimp, or a worm? Comparative embryology of vertebrates supports evolutionary theory. What that means is you look at how, for example, natural selection would suggest that humans and chimpanzees are very, very closely related. Now, if that was the case, comparative embryology would suggest that the development of the organism would match that similarity in connectedness. And it's absolutely true. As a matter of fact, if you look at a baby chimpanzee and a baby person, there's no difference at all, no observable difference up to about 2 or 3 months. Now, if you look at a human and a chicken, there's some similarities, but we diverge fairly early in the development so that they end up looking like a chicken and we look like a human. But because humans and chimps are so closely related, we look almost exactly the same up until really, really late in the process. And believe it or not, most of the significant changes that happen to an organism happen before 3 months of age. The most significant changes happen in the first month of development. Now, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. What does that mean? It might be extra credit, so pay attention. Ontogeny is the study of the development of individuals, basically comparative embryology. So ontogeny is kind of like comparative embryology. Recapitulates means reinforces, supports, gives evidence for. Phylogeny. Now, phylogeny means what organisms belong where on the big family tree. You guys may have seen a family tree before, where all the organisms live. Basically, what is their relationship to each other? Now, some people believe that humans go up on top and all the animals are just kind of a pool on the bottom. That's not very scientific. You would notice that humans and cats and bears are mammals, and that we're also vertebrates, so we share some characteristics with lizards, but then we share very few characteristics with worms. So on the big family tree, by looking at the development of the individual, it reinforces the notion that organisms on the family tree belong there because you can see those similarities in their own development. Now, this is a somewhat controversial statement. And as a matter of fact, the student in my teaching history who got the most points was the one who debunked this, basically said this is not true at all. And so if you come up with a good argument in support or against it, do a little research, read about this. You just type this in and you'll find all kinds of articles. This is probably, I'm pretty sure, going to be an extra credit question on the chapter that covers, the test that covers this chapter. You guys get the idea? So do a little research, you might get some extra credit. Okay, so remember I was talking about the differences between humans and chickens? Well, at this stage, the changes are not that different. So wait a minute. Gill pouches, what does the chicken or a human need with gills? We don't, neither one needs it. But both chickens and humans descended from organisms that lived in the water. I know it's unpleasant for many of you to consider this, but these structures here, gill pouches, in both chickens and humans, end up turning into our middle ear bone so we can hear. But if this happened to be in a fish, they would have turned into gill slits. So it does show that we have an ancestry that's still built into us as we develop. We also have what is called a postanal tail. Now, as when we're born, that tail doesn't stick out. Our buttocks and our legs kind of cover it, but we still have a thing called coccyx, which is a little tiny vestigial tail tucked up between our butt cheeks. It shows our connection. Now, if you look at a human and a chick, the similarities are very, very similar. After this point, we start to diverge in development. The chicken starts to look more like a chicken. We start looking more like a person, but at this level. So what it shows is the further back you go, the more similar the groups are, because now we're in the center of the tree of relatedness, the phylogenetic tree of all living things. Hope that makes sense. All right, let's talk a little bit more about Darwin. Darwin's finches. Now, Darwin's finches are pretty famous because when he was on the Galapagos, he noticed that the birds matched their environment, and as a matter of fact, the kind of tree that they lived in. They're an excellent example of natural selection and adaptive evolution. The idea here is that if you go back far enough in the fossil record, on the Galapagos, there's no birds at all. And then you find, if you dig a little bit more shallow, there's a group of kind of generic looking finches. They're just regular finches. And as you move your way further and further up in the layers, you find more different kinds of finches. What does adaptive evolution mean? It means that as they spread out into different areas, different kinds of trees, cactuses, grasslands, being a generic bird isn't very helpful. You have to be more specialized. And so adaptive evolution means over time, the group changes so that they can get more resources in their particular habitat. And take notes here on adaptive radiation. Okay, so there's some large ground finches that eat seeds, small tree finches that try to catch insects, and then the woodpecker finch actually drills holes in the trees and uses a tool to get larvae out to eat them. Kind of cool, but they're all finches. Now, when Darwin took these skins back to his ornithologist friend in England, an ornithologist study birds, Darwin thought they were different, completely different kinds of birds. And the friend said, nope, these are all finches. Darwin was like, what? And so when he realized they were all finches, he was like, wait a minute, if they were all finches, then maybe we had a group of finches that spread out when they got to the Galapagos. And that's indeed what happened according to the fossil record. Okay, so this is what happened. So a group of finches found themselves being blown off course by a storm, floating on a raft of debris, whatever. There was a small group of them found themselves on the Galapagos Islands. So now there's no other finches around. There's no other birds around. So what happened is now there's different environments in which they could live. What they discovered was being a generic finch was not the greatest way to survive. So what they found is that the warbler finches, which would be catching insects, by having a slightly larger beak, you could catch the insects better. So if this ancestor had a slightly larger beak, you could catch insects and started living where the insects were to be found. These ones and this is this here, but the green warbler finch also catch insects, but they're named based on their song. So all of these catch insects. The bud eaters eat flowers. The seed eaters, notice the really powerful beak for crushing the seed and getting it out. But the idea is that because there were different environments on the Galapagos Islands, the ones that had the slightly stronger beaks were more successful there, and those slight differences in the original group got magnified over time, because the bigger and stronger your beak was, the better you could eat seeds. Now, remember, the individuals didn't change. It was the group that changed. So of many finches, the one that had the thickest beak could survive in that environment better because it could crush more seeds and get more resources. So this shows you the evolution of the finches on the Galapagos Islands over time. Okay, Darwin's theory of natural selection. Darwin based his theory of natural selection on two key observations. Now, there's a difference between an observation and an opinion. Now, if I said the statement, Mr. Sage is a good teacher, is that an observation or an opinion? Can you guys put that in? Wait a minute, I guess I don't know how to. Well, anyway, I'm not going to ask you, I'm not going to grind you on that. But my students used to say, well, that's an observation. No, it's not. If you believe I'm a good teacher, that's awesome, but it's an opinion. Mr. Sage is wearing a dark blue shirt. That's not an opinion, that's an observation. So an observation is something that normal people wouldn't disagree about. The observation that these fungi are producing spores is an observation. These fungi are disgusting, that's an opinion. You guys get the difference? Okay, the key observations. His theory of natural selection is based on two key observations. First, overproduction. Now, other than humans, most organisms have more babies than can survive. And which ones survive? What we are normally taught is the strongest ones. Well, that's very generic and not very helpful. It's not the strongest one always. It's the one that has the best adaptations. So, for example, you guys remember the movie, it's kind of pretty old at this point, but Finding Nemo. Not Finding Dory, which was the sequel, but Finding Nemo. If you remember, Nemo had dozens of siblings, and only he survived. Well, that was because a barracuda attacked and ate all of his siblings, and he got lucky by tumbling out of the nest. Now, it turns out luck actually matters, but in reality, it's true. In a large group, let's say you see all these sea turtles hatching. Most of those aren't going to survive. They're going to get eaten by something, birds on their way into the ocean, sharks, whatever. And which one survives? Well, it's usually the one that's better adapted, but it could also be the one that gets lucky. And luck actually does play a role. But observation one, more offspring are born than can survive. So that's an observation. Anybody can notice this if you study living organisms. More things are produced than can survive. This leads to a struggle for existence. Which one is going to find the resources? Some of it is luck, and some of it is, does it happen to have a unique combination of genes that works well in the current local environment? Please remember that. The current local environment. If you happen to have genes that match that, you will thrive and you'll have lots of offspring, and those genes will be passed on. Observation two, individual variation. Well, how many different species of beetles can you count here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? No. Look at what it says. These are all one species of beetle. Does that make sense? How can one species look so different? Well, look at people. We have lots of different looking groups of people, right? Different races of people are all still human, right? So even though there's a lot of variation with this group and variation within humans, we're all the same species. These are all the same species. But the question is, why do they look different? Well, it turns out that this particular beetle would probably live in a really dark environment, so it would blend in, and these beetles would live in places where it would blend in. Or this pattern could mean that this beetle is poisonous. Anyway, the idea is that they would live in different environments and have different areas that would suit their particular genotype. All right, variation exists among individuals, and much of this variation is inherited. So for example, the difference between the rock and I, him having big muscles and me not having big muscles, is not genetic. So he can't pass on those muscles. But most of the things that make these beetles different from each other are passed on to their offspring. So if we take observation one, more babies can survive than are born than can survive, and that there's variation within the group, within the species, what is the inference? The inference is differential reproductive success, or natural selection. What that means is the ones that happen to have the better genes will have more babies than the ones that don't. And better in this case is only defined by whether it matches the current local environment. That's what determines better in terms of genes. Those individuals with traits, genes, best suited for the current local environment leave more fertile offspring. Now, what do we mean by fertile offspring? Well, for example, if you made a donkey and a horse together, you have a mule. That's not fertile. That means that a horse and a donkey are separate species. That's a really good example of that. So why do horses and donkeys mate with each other? Well, it's because you put a male horse in with a female donkey. You can't do the reverse because the donkey can't really get up on the horse. The male donkey can't get up on a female horse. But a male horse can get down onto a female donkey. Now, why would they do this? Well, males want to mate with anything that's close. You ever seen a dog? They'll mate with dang near anything. It doesn't even have to be a mammal if they're in the mood. So the idea is you can tell that they're separate species, partly because the offspring that comes out, the mule, cannot have babies of its own. That's not the only way to tell if organisms are separate species, but it's a really obvious one. So why were mules ever created? Well, it turns out donkeys are really good in the desert, like here in the Barstow area, and horses are really strong. So what if you wanted the strength of a horse with the ability to survive the desert of a donkey? Well, you make a mule. Mules were employed in Death Valley to haul borax to boron, which was named for its history of refining borax to be a laundry additive, which makes the detergents more effective. Anyway, there you go. Okay, back to this. Those offspring inherit their useful traits from their parents and pass them on to their offspring. The key is, if my parents were successful and had lots of offspring, I'll probably be successful and have lots of offspring if the environment hasn't changed much between those generations. Okay, mechanisms of microevolution. So this is what I call the mouse graphs. So pay attention to the mouse graphs. This is the whole second half of this lecture. The first cause of now when we talk about microevolution, it means small changes to a group over a fairly evolutionarily short amount of time. Not, rats into monkeys. That's a macroevolutionary change. These are small changes that can be very easily documented over time. Genetic drift, I'll be talking about that. Gene flow, I'll discuss that. Mutations, I'll be talking about that. And natural selection. So we've already mentioned a little bit about natural selection. Let's get to each one of these. Genetic drift. Now, question. If you're in the ocean on a life raft and you're drifting with the currents, are you going into a particular place that you want to go? Well, the answer is no. If you're drifting, you're changing your location, but it's not any place you want to go or any purposeful place you want to go. You just find yourself there as a result of the environment pushing you where the currents take you. In this case, it's genetic changes that happen somewhat randomly. It's the change in the gene pool of a small population due to chance. Normally, that population has to be isolated. For example, chance. Something significant happens to that population that is not normal, something out of normal. So what I will do is I will tell you about the elephants and the flowers. Okay, this figure may be on the test and I'll be asking you, what does it show? Okay, so we're going to start with generation 1. And what we're going to say here is that the red allele, the red gene, is dominant to the white allele, which is little r. If you guys remember your genetics, the dominant is the capital, the lowercase is the recessive, in this case, red, capital R for red, little r for white, because it's on the same spot on the chromosome. So any of these flowers that have the hidden recessive still look red, but some of them have double recessive, so you can see it. Now, what happened is between generation 1 and generation 2, the ones that are circled, or whatever you call the shape, survived. Now, the story that helps students understand this is elephants. If you guys know anything about elephants, they migrate or move to places where there's more food. On their way to moving, they have to go through a narrow canyon. In the bottom of this canyon, and I'm making this up, by the way, but it works well. In the bottom of this canyon are these flowers, this group in generation 1. Now, the ones that have the circles around, though, are the ones that survived, didn't get trampled by the elephants. Okay, so now these are the only genes left over. All of these red genes and maybe one of the white genes got stomped on. So the circled ones survived. So here we are in generation 2. Notice there's a lot more white flowers because a lot of the red flowers randomly got stomped on. Now, elephants don't look down and stomp on certain colors. They just walk, right? So this is bad luck. These ones here that didn't survive had bad luck. But now, if you know anything about elephants, when they eat somewhere, they have to come back to their home range. And so they come back through. In this case, there was even fewer flowers and more elephants. And only these 2 flowers survived. The double dominant survived. All the white ones and all the heterozygotes got stomped on. Now look here at the end. All the white genes disappeared, not because white was a terrible color, but because they got unlucky. In this case, we got rid of all the white genes just because they happened to get stomped on. So you can see it from this generation to this, we had more white. From this generation to this, we had lost all the white due to bad luck. And this has to be a small, isolated group because otherwise the genes would mix with each other and take it back to normal. So this shows you genetic drift is a change in this group due to some random disaster, usually is what happens. Okay, rabbits. So this is from your text. If you look at this, you see that from one generation to the next, the ones that are circled reproduce, so you get fewer white ones. And then basically the almost exact same thing. And then if only these 2 can reproduce, all the white genes are gone, Now, in this case, it's brown versus white rather than red versus white, and it's rabbits versus flowers, but the idea is the same. This is in your text, and you can see saying the same thing. Bottleneck effect. This is also a figure from your text. So this is the original population. If you're only able to pour out a small number, look at the reds didn't even end up in the cup. The surviving population, the red ones, disappeared, because if you can only select 10 of these little marbles, what if the red didn't make it in there? It's an example of genetic drift. That is, you significantly reduce the population and some of the variation is lost. Results from a dramatic reduction in population size. So instead of this population, now we have this population, and you're not going to get a perfect random distribution. You're only going to get what happened to survive. It may not even necessarily be in the most adaptive, the best, what we would call the strongest surviving. Okay, bottlenecking population reduces genetic variation. So the idea is, instead of all this variation, only a small number can survive, and only the genes in that group. So the cheetahs, several thousand years ago, most of them died, and we don't know why. We don't think it was humans causing it, because humans don't hunt cheetahs. The best guess is that there was some kind of a plague that affected cheetahs, and almost all of them died. Now, how do we know this if it happened so long ago? When you take the genetic, do the genetic workup of all the cheetahs that they found that most cheetahs are closely related to each other. That could only happen if there was a very small group of them that survived, and then they started reproducing with each other, giving rise to all the cheetahs. Now, is this a good thing or a bad thing? It's a bad thing, because the very fact that most of the cheetahs died, the only reason why cheetahs are even alive today is because some of the cheetah were different than the others of them, and they survived. A good example in fiction is a movie called The Stand, which is based on a book by Stephen King. So in that book, there's a virus. Give me a second here. There's a virus that kills most of the people on Earth, and some people survive because they happen to have an immune system that makes them survive. So that was the case with the cheetah. Some of them survived, but genetic bottlenecking is what happened to them, and now all the cheetahs are similar to each other, which puts them at risk, because if another really nasty disease comes through, they don't have the variation that saved them the first time, they could all go extinct. Okay, the founder effect. Please note, founder effect means like the founder is someone who starts something. A flounder is a fish, from Little Mermaid. So founder effect and flounder effect are not the same thing, okay? Please make a note of that, because that's the wrong answer on the test. The founder effect, like the founder of our feast, the founders of our country, is genetic drift in a new colony. And this is what happens. You take a small group of people that separate themselves, or any organism separates itself from the big group, like the organisms on the Galapagos, or like settlers going to the West. It's genetic drift in a new colony. So, for example, certain inherited disorders are much, much higher than you would expect in the general population. So, for example, the Ashkenazi Jews were the ones that left, according to history, left Egypt thousands of years ago. And what they did is they isolated themselves in the desert. So the people who left Egypt with that original group of Jews had the gene for cystic fibrosis, I think. I'm trying to remember the disease. But now when you look at that group of individuals, wherever they are in the world, the rates of that particular disease are way higher amongst that group, because this small group of Jewish migrants settled in the desert and didn't mix with the rest of the human population, just interbred. So that particular rare disease in other people was magnified in that group, because they didn't breed with other, didn't reproduce, mate, marry with other people for a long time. And that's a good example of the founder effect. If you isolate yourself and only have a small number of people to breed with, then you're gonna, whatever the people come with, diseases, benefits, whatever, is gonna be magnified in that group until you start mixing with outside individuals. How do these settlers show the founder effect of retinitis pigmentosa? Well, let's say this one guy brought the gene for it, hiding as a recessive. Now, all of his children, or half of his children, are going to have it. And then if these children mate with the other settlers, and there's not going to be very many of them, lots and lots of kids will have retinitis pigmentosum because there's not as many options to mate with. Okay, gene flow. Gene flow means the movement of genes from one place to the other. So what does this picture show? Well, if you take all the women from their DMV photos and merge them or morph them together, this is what you get. So this is kind of the average woman in the United States, especially California. You see this kind of person a lot. Why? Because people intermarry. Some people African-American heritage, Asian American heritage, Hispanic heritage, Caucasian heritage. If you blend them all together from the DMV photos, this is what you get for a woman. So it's kind of interesting. And so if you look at this, the title here, it's pretty interesting. Okay. Genetic exchange with another population, it tends to reduce genetic differences between populations. So is genetic differences between populations good? Not necessarily. The genetic differences between populations, especially in human, tends to lead to discrimination. The fact that people look different from each other lends to discrimination. If all the different racial groups start to intermarry and everybody looks the same, racism can't exist anymore. But most racial groups tend to intermarry with that same racial group, so those differences tend to be retained. But you do see intermarriages between racial groups a lot more than you used to, and so that's reducing variation between those groups. And that can happen between different species as well, or different races in the same species of organism. Now, the fact that an African-American person would find Asian American person attractive and not be forced in the same way the horse was forced to mate with the donkey indicates clearly that we are the same species. There's no forcing involved. They just happen to find each other attractive. That demonstrates that different races of human beings are all the same species because there's no forcing. How does this cover show gene flow? Well, if you have all these different people coming together in the same place, let's say California, if there's enough intermarrying, this is what the population ends up looking like if enough intermarrying happens over enough generations. Okay, mutation. What is a mutation? It's any change to an organism's DNA, basically a random change to the DNA. They alone do not have much effect on a large population, but they provide the raw material for change. And that is, you guys know the expression, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, nature doesn't do that. Nature tries to break stuff all the time. Usually it doesn't help the individual, but it could provide the raw material for a change in the DNA that would be helpful later on. So for example, what if there's a change in your DNA that makes you slightly disadvantaged now, here, but what if the environment changes and that change that made you disadvantaged in the current time makes your offspring far more advantaged? And that's one of the things that drives evolution. They can have significant cumulative effects on the population. That is, if the mutations happen over and over, or those mutations are passed down and then start to come out, can make a big difference. Are most mutations good? No. In the same way that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If you have a complex system like the DNA of an individual, usually a random change to it is going to cause a problem. But there's a small chance, 1 in 1,000, 1 in a million chance that that change could actually be really beneficial, especially in the future. And that's why mutations are still something that happen to all organisms' DNA. Is this baby a common mutation? No, it's not. It's probably not even a mutation. It's a congenital defect rather than a mutation. Why? Because it's not something that's built into our DNA to have a two-headed baby, because the two-headed baby either wouldn't be able to survive or probably would not be able to reproduce. Okay, of all the causes of microevolution, natural selection is the only one that's generally adaptive. That means makes the group more successful over time. Adaptive means a tendency towards increased number, more offspring, and fitness, healthiness of the offspring. Darwinian fitness. Darwinian fitness is the contribution an individual makes to the gene pool of the next generation relative to the contributions of other individuals. So for example, if you have 10 kids and your neighbor has 2, you're more Darwinianly fit than your neighbor because you're passing on more of your genes to the future. Now, we don't always identify that as success, but Darwin would say the family of 10 kids is far more successful biologically than the family with 2. It's ironic that people who tend to make more money have fewer kids, and people who make more middle income tend to have larger families. That's cultural usually. But wealthy individuals tend to be, in my experience, more selfish. Having kids is not a selfish thing. It's a selfless thing. And if you want to have time, lots and lots of time to enjoy your money, don't have kids. All right. 3 general outcomes of natural selection. The first is called net directional selection. Now, this is the first mouse graph. Now, I need to explain what it's showing. This fig graph on the top is showing the original population. Now, what does this graph mean? The height of the line tells you how many of those individuals there are. So, for example, the medium brown mouse, there's lots of them because the graph is really tall here. The dark brown mice, there's hardly any of them. And the very light mice, there's hardly any of them. Now, why would this be the case? What if the ground was this color? Well, if the ground was this color, mostly these mice would be able to survive and not be seen by hawks and other predators. So they would be able to reproduce more, and the dark colored ones and the very light colored ones would stand out more. Now, there's a chance that a few of these light ones could survive by random luck, or they find themselves in a lighter environment, the dark ones finding themselves in a dark environment, but being medium is really the best way to go in the current environment. But what happens if the environment changes? What if the environment now, instead of being medium brown, goes to a darker brown? So it's called directional selection because the original population, which is in dash, gets pushed in a direction to the right towards the darker colored individuals. Now the average mouse is a darker brown, and the lighter colored ones go extinct because now the environment is a darker color. And so now this becomes the what is called the bell-shaped curve because it looks like a bell. And the average now is darker. It's called directional because it's moving in a particular direction towards something. One extreme is selected against. In this case, the lighter colored mice are selected against. They can't survive because the environment just doesn't have any room for them anymore. It shifts the phenotypic curve of the population. This is the curve we're talking about, the bell-shaped curve. That is, the average has the most, and the outliers have very few. It selects in favor of some extreme phenotype. In this case, in the case of these darker mice, it selects in favor of them and against the lighter colored mice. Can lead to speciation. Now, what could cause speciation, or the creation of a new species? Well, what if instead of the environment changing, some of these mice, like the finches of the Galapagos, move to a new area that's just darker in color? So we still have this population, but now, because some of these mice moved to a darker environment, now this is the group. Now, what happens is over time, if this group changes and starts acting different and smelling different and looking different, if they happen to meet each other, they would say, well, I know that's a mouse. I get that it's a mouse, but I'm just not attracted. I want my group that is darker in color, that smells a certain way, that acts a certain way. And this group over here, our original population, they just don't look appealing anymore to me. So the idea is if enough time passes and enough change happens, they just wouldn't hook up with each other. Now, that doesn't mean they couldn't mate if you forced them to each other, but they wouldn't pick each other if given an option for their own. So for example, let's go back to the horses and donkeys. If you guys know anything about the desert Southwest, there are groups of wild horses and there are groups of wild donkeys. Why don't you ever see any wild mules? Well, is it the case that they never run across each other? No, it's not the case. In certain places where there's water, you're going to find mules and wild mustangs, horses together. So why don't they mate? It's because the horses have other horses as options and the donkeys have donkeys as options. No horse is going to look at a donkey and say, give me some of that. So why does it happen? Because the male and the female are isolated, there's no options. That's why you get a mule. But because the donkeys and the horses never choose to mate with each other when given the option for their own group, that demonstrates that they're separate species. Now, different races of people don't do that. They don't always choose that same racial group. They often will cross racial boundaries without being forced. That shows that the different races are the same species. So there you go. Because they don't ever choose to mate with each other, it demonstrates that they're separate species. Even if when you mated these two, you came out with a baby, and even if that baby was fertile, you could still call them separate species because they would never pick each other in the natural environment, even when they're near each other. I hope that makes sense. That's why horses and donkeys are separate species, even though they can have mules as offspring. Even if the mule was fertile, it's still a separate species because they don't ever pick each other when given the option if they have their own as a choice. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so let's talk about the English pepper moths. I would definitely be asking you to tell me all about these guys, so take some detailed notes. All right, how many moths do you see? Well, if you were a bird flying by, you'd probably see the white one, but you wouldn't see the black one because the black one is camouflaged. You'd see the white one, and you'd probably eat this one and leave this one alone. Now, if you were a dark moth on a dark tree, you get a big advantage. But if you were a dark moth on a light tree, the advantage would go to the other moth. And what's interesting is these moths don't know what color they are, and they don't really even know what color the tree is. They're not very bright. So they happen to land on whatever tree they land on. And if they happen to land on a good tree, that is a tree that matches their color, they survive by not being eaten. And if they land on the wrong tree, because they don't know any better, they get eaten. So let's talk about what happened in England with the pepper moths. Now, why are they called pepper moths? Because it looks like someone sprinkled pepper on their wings. All right. So this is a figure from your text. Be sure to take a look at your book. The original population was lighter in color. Okay. Then what happened was, over time, what happened was the Industrial Revolution. Now, notice it says, dark-colored pepper moths are better camouflaged against a sooty environment. Thus, as the Industrial Revolution progressed in 19th century England, the color of moth population shifted from light to dark. So what do we mean by that? Well, before the Industrial Revolution, which was the end of the 1700s and early 1800s, people made what they wanted to make at home. Whatever they needed to make, they made it their homes. Then during the Industrial Revolution, everybody started to move to cities because that's where the work was. Now, in the cities, they had factories. The factories at that time needed an energy source to generate enough heat to do the work of, let's say, melting stuff like metal. So what did they use for fuel? They used coal. And coal, as you know, is a very dirty fuel. And that's why most societies are trying to get rid of it, even though people are fighting against it. Coal is dirty. And why is it dirty? Because when it comes out of a chimney, it floats along and sticks onto things, making them dark colored. It's pollution, really nasty pollution. Well, when people started moving into the cities and they started building factories and they used coal to power those factories, the soot from the chimneys would stick to the trees. Now, the original trees, called ash trees, were light colored. So the light colored ash trees and these pepper moths worked well together. The pepper moths could land on whatever tree and they were just fine. The birds wouldn't see them. But over time, the trees started getting darker and darker because the soot from the factories stuck onto the trees, making these guys easy to see and pick off. These guys did exist. You can see that they did exist here, but not very many of them because they could be easily seen on the light colored trees. But they found ways to survive. As the trees got darker and darker, these guys started being picked off and these guys started surviving better. And so what you saw during the Industrial Revolution was lots and lots of these guys, hardly any of these guys. Now, the question is, do you think England is still burning coal and polluting its trees? No, it is not. So now, since they started cleaning up their act, the old dark trees from the Industrial Revolution have died, decomposed, and new ash trees, light-colored ash trees, have formed. So now this population, originally going to dark due to soot, now has started heading back towards lighter-colored moths because these new trees don't have the soot on them, because England, being smart, doesn't use coal. All right, let's go through the notes on that. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the trees in England were light colored. They were called ash trees, A-S-H, ash, as in ashes when you burn something. Not coal, not coal. If you burn like wood, the ashes are light colored. That's why they call it ash trees. The pepper moths lived in two different varieties or morphs. One was light and one was dark. The dark morph or alleles were less abundant because the dark moths were seen by birds and eaten. This is before the Industrial Revolution. So they were selected against. During the Industrial Revolution, soot from the factories burning coal turned the bark on the trees a dark brownish black. So now these dark ones that were barely surviving, they started to thrive. What effect do you think it had on the population of moths? So it went from light to dark. Now, the question I have for you guys to see if you're paying attention is, how many I got to see if I can figure out how I can get the chat. Here we go. Okay, now we had to break out of this. I don't know why I can't do chat while I'm sharing, but what was I going to ask? Oh, question. Check your understanding, guys. Are you still paying it? Is anybody still there who's listening to me? Type something in the chat if you're listening. Awesome. Okay, Bella, how many of those moths do you think changed from light to dark or dark to light? How many of those actual moths, the individual moths, changed? Remember what I said? How many moths, individual moths, changed color? Just take a guess. 3. It's a good guess. The answer is 0. Why is it 0? Anybody want to take a guess as to why it's 0? 0 moths changed colors. You remember were you guys paying attention when I talked about what happens over time? No? Anyway, you're probably feeling like, I don't remember. Remember I said the individuals over the changes that happen, either micro or macro evolution, don't affect the individuals. It affects the group. So what happens is if there's some light ones and some dark ones, those moths don't change, but the dark ones reproduce more and the light ones get eaten. Does that make sense? So the individuals don't change, it's the group that changes. So if there's a few dark ones and they start to reproduce more, now there's a lot more dark ones, even though the individuals never change colors. Does that make sense? The dark ones who happen to be dark have more babies. The light ones who happen to be light couldn't have babies because they were eaten by birds. Hope that makes sense. Anyway. Okay, so we talked about this. So the idea is none of the moths change colors, but over time the group changed because the dark ones were able to have more babies during the Industrial Revolution. Then afterwards, it shifted right back. It's called directional selection because it headed towards the dark colored ones. The individuals didn't change, but the group changed towards the direction of dark. Now that England has cleaned up the pollution, the trees have become white again. What effect has this had? So if it went towards dark, now it's going back the other way, towards white, towards the original color of the trees and the moths. Okay, another mouse graph. Okay, we still have our original population, but what happens if being average is not good? What if only the extremes is a way to survive? So imagine, this is a little ridiculous, but it makes sense. What if instead of a medium brown environment, there's only light patches and dark patches? For example, places where there's snow and dark colored muddy dirt. In that case, being average brown, medium brown is not great. It's much better to either be light or dark because medium just cannot survive. So in this environment, being medium is great. Being extreme, not so great. But if you go to a new environment or the environment changes and now there's only light areas and only dark areas, being average is terrible. It can disrupt a single population into 2 or more contrasting phenotypes in a population and can lead to speciation if the disruption lasts long enough. So if these are kept separate and they're not really allowed to mate, this one will start changing and this one will start changing. And if they somehow are able to get together, it'd be like, nah, not my thing. I like the light mice, or these guys would say, I like the dark mice. And how the mice would react to each other after enough time had passed. Now, please note, they would still know it's a mouse. They're not that stupid, but they wouldn't be attracted. They wouldn't mate if they had had a chance to change enough. Now, human racial groups are different from each other, right? But not enough time has changed so that people refuse to mate with each other when given the option. So human racial groups are due to the fact that each of these groups kind of evolved to a certain extent in their own current local environment, Africa, Asia, North America. But it wasn't enough time to make speciation happen in different racial groups. The evidence is when you put them back together, they'll mate with each other. Okay, stabilizing selection. In this case, it's good to be average, but it's not just good to be average, it's the only thing that will survive. Being in the extreme is just too difficult for them to survive. So the idea is if you're outside the average, you're just not going to make it. Does that ever happen? Yes, it does. Reduces variation for a particular trait, phenotypes stay within a narrow range. Now, why would this be beneficial? Well, what if the only way to survive is to be average? Being extreme, you just can't make it. There's nowhere to go. So it usually does not lead to speciation because you're not going to have a big difference over time. You're just going to have a narrowing in the stabilization selection means only average can survive. Now, when does this actually happen? Let me tell you about how it happens in babies, either birth weight or head size. So let me explain to you. Now, if instead of talking about the colors of mice, what if the average here is an average size baby with an average size head? Now, you guys know up until maybe you didn't know, but up until fairly recently, you guys know what a cesarean section is, where they cut the baby out and can come out? Up until the last 100 years, cesarean sections were just not a thing. They weren't practiced because medicine did not know how to do it. So what that meant was if the baby couldn't get out of mom, both baby and mom would die. So the question is, what if the baby is too big 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago? Too big to get out, then they would die. Too big, you can't get out. Well, what if you're too small, especially in your head? If your head is really small, it's called microcephaly. Well, you're born without as much ability to survive. Having a big brain is really beneficial. But way back in the day, 1,000 years ago, too big a brain, you couldn't get out. Too small a brain, people didn't want to mate with you because you just didn't have the mental faculties to be appealing. So what that meant is you had to have a big head, but not too big. So in humans, this is the size of babies' heads right now, because they got to be big enough to have enough brain in there to be successful, but they can't be too big, otherwise they can't get out. Now with cesarean sections, that pressure to keep the baby's body weight and head size very, very stable is no longer there. So we may see brains getting bigger, brains getting smaller, probably bigger, but we'll never end up probably megamind because it's not very beneficial. Anyway, there you go. The average is the only one that can survive. And with humans, birth weight and head size is a good example of that in the past. Okay, sickle cell anemia. Now, this is what a normal red blood cell looks like, and this is what sickle cell red blood cells look like. They go from being normal to this shape under low oxygen conditions. It affects 1 out of every 500 African Americans or other people from Africa, southern Middle East, and certain parts of Southern Asia. Now, why does it affect these groups to such a large extent? Well, I'll explain it. It causes red blood cells to become misshapen and cause severe pain and even death. Now, what's the problem? Well, this shape and size, red blood cell can easily go through capillaries, which are the tiniest blood vessels we have in our bodies. These do not. They get stuck. If blood can't flow through capillaries, it can't deliver oxygen. If you don't get oxygen, the tissue dies. It's extremely painful and can lead to death. But so why would this gene have evolved and why would it have been retained? Well, it turns out that the gene for sickle cell isn't all bad. The disease is bad, but the gene is actually beneficial to people who live in Africa, Southern Asia, and Southern Saudi Arabia and places like that. It's more common among African Americans and other African peoples, Southern Middle East and Southern Asia. But why? Why did it evolve and why was it retained? Well, you have to look at a disease that kills a lot of people still. #1 killer of people in the world is malaria. Now, most of the people who live in this band, this green band, don't have access to anti-malarial drugs or anti-malarial vaccinations. This is where malaria is. So if you live there and you get bitten by a mosquito that's carrying malaria, you'll often die. These people, especially in the distant past, had no medical treatment for it. But what they found was that the sickle cell gene, if it's hiding as a hidden recessive, is not completely hiding. It turns out it's doing hidden work. It's actually making you resistant to malaria. So the gene for sickle cell anemia, when it's not being expressed as a disease, it's hiding, it's actually benefiting the person who has it. Notice this is where the sickle cell gene is. So if you're hiding a recessive for sickle cell anemia, it means you're not going to get malaria, which is really beneficial because millions of people die from malaria every year in this area. So you can see that the gene, while being problematic if you have two recessives giving you the disease, having one recessive doesn't hurt you at all. It actually benefits you if you live in this area. So you can see where the sickle cell gene is and where malaria is very, very similar. If the person is homozygous recessive, they show sickle cell, can lead to death, not so great. If the person is homozygous dominant, there's no malaria protection. Most people in America who don't have African or Southern Asian roots don't have this gene at all because there's no benefit. Mostly North America and Northern Europe doesn't have malaria. But if you have the hidden recessive, it's very beneficial because you're going to not have to worry about malaria. So it's spread through the African and Southern Asian areas because having it meant you survived malaria. Malaria still kills more people than any other disease in the world. Now, if you or I, who don't have any of these genes, go to these areas, you have to get a vaccination. And if you get malaria, you get medicine for it. But many of the people who live here still don't have access to that medical care. So having that hidden recessive is beneficial. All right. Where are we? Okay. Hopefully that was helpful for you guys. Do you have any questions about what I just covered? Bella? No, you good? Okay, is there a test this week? I couldn't remember if there's a test. Bella, Junis, are you guys, is there a test in this week's module? I didn't check. No, okay. So anyway, I hope to see you guys in lab on Monday. So work on those review questions. I can't remember if there's I think there might be a Labster. Get that Labster done. Get those review questions done. Get your lab report from this week done. Hope to see you on Monday in class. Have a great rest of your week and a good weekend. See you then, guys. Bye.